can discuss them later on in the rooms. First of all, let me thank you so much for inviting me. I am very happy to be in a hotel room for the first time in 9 months. I have to say, it feels welcoming. It feels almost like at the home I missed. I wish we could see each other in person, but well, I think this will be just fine anyhow. So when we speak about migration today, first of all, the right answer to the percentage is 10%. And I think 50% of you got that right. What's interesting is that most people think that we are being overwhelmed. And when I say we, I obviously refer to what I usually call the white wealthy and the worried, are being overwhelmed by influxes and waves of migration. And that, for instance, in 2015, there was a huge migration crisis in Europe. In IOM, and I have to really make the point that I'm not speaking for IOM. I left IOM in July. I have vast experience with IOM, but the person following me in my role there will probably not be happy if I go around and pretend that I still speak for them. But in IOM, we always said that there was no migration crisis. There was a crisis of management of migration, which brings me to an important point, and that is that in many destination states, but also states of transit states these days, the management of migration is sorely lacking, and that it's extremely difficult these days to migrate in a legal way, in a regular way. Point to mention is that no migrant is illegal, because a human being cannot be illegal. Telling or using the term illegal migrants is the same as saying that if I stole a purse, I would be an illegal woman. I don't think anybody would sort of start calling me that. So it's a little bit disconcerting that it's so easy to call a group of the population illegals. Anyhow, what we always said that is that there is a migration management crisis, because if you look at, for instance, the labor market needs in most destination states, migrants are really needed, and regular migration is needed. Today, in many destination states, there's a lot of irregular migration, which means that irregular migrants are more at risk of being exploited in the labor market. And for the economy and for the rest of us as such, that also means that they don't pay into pension schemes. They don't necessarily pay into social security schemes, which we all need, because unless we have the entire labor force paying into things like that, well, we will have to work until we are 92, something that I personally would really not like. So there is a bigger argument for protecting the rights of migrants, which goes way beyond just protecting the individual in question. It is really about creating cohesive societies. Human rights is all about everybody getting a possibility to benefit from the opportunities that life is, well, not supposed to give us, but at least not to be constantly slapped in the head because you were so unfortunate to be born into poverty with very few options. And there is a lot of migration taking place these days, which as such is not forced, in the sense that it's not due to persecution, it's not due to war, but it is most definitely due to lack of options in the country of origin. So that people take on very perilous journeys that people like you and I, and here I'm obviously making a presumption about your life, but I don't think you and I would usually go on those journeys with a light heart, and also end up in situations of vulnerability, very much due to a lack of legal migration channels. There is a lot of money, of donor money from states, being thrown at projects on reducing vulnerability of migrants, but without these members or these states thinking about the fact that their own policies are creating those vulnerabilities. Because if you set out, for instance, as a relatively resilient person going towards Europe, and then due to European Union migration policies, you end up in a detention center in Libya, I can assure you that after a few days there, you are no longer resilient. You have turned into somebody in a position of vulnerability, which then other projects are going to pay to presumably get you out of. There also seems to be, when we talk about migration, and actually I think the poll was also interesting from that point of view, a huge focus on numbers instead of values. We talk about the numbers that are dying in the Mediterranean. We talk about the numbers that are not coming, instead of looking a little bit as to what are our values, what are the values that our societies are actually built upon, and to then look at the value of a true respect for everybody's rights would actually bring to those societies. Migrants contribute to society even when they are irregular, simply by buying things, by producing things, but they are obviously more at risk when they are vulnerable, when they are irregular. I thought that the title of today's event was for me, very personally, quite entertaining, because for me the SDGs and migration has been linked since the SDGs, well, before they actually came out, because we were in the process of negotiating them, and we've been working on the SDGs from a migration perspective for the past 5 years and even before that. So I think what the SDGs are, they're not the best thing since hot water or sliced bread, but they are a tool, and specifically when you go below this, the goals to the targets, they are a tool to ensure, well, at least to promote better development. And migration cannot be taken out of that or considered separately. Migration is a multi-stakeholder and multilateral phenomenon. And I think that finally, even if rhetorics around the board, specifically from central governments, very often say the opposite, states are realizing this. And that's also why we now have what's called the Global Compact on Migration. What is entertaining or sad, I don't know, to see is when you know what's going on behind the scenes, and the politics that are actually, or the documents that are actually being signed by prime ministers who very vocally go out and say, we want to close the borders, we don't want any migrants to come in, basically they can all just drown in the Mediterranean Sea. And then at the same time you see documents coming out signed by said ministries saying we actually need 500,000 migrant workers to support our economy. Those things make you reflect on the reality of what is actually needed, and I'm not saying this so that we only consider migrants as something actually that we need, but that there is a real need. And this rhetoric around closing the borders and not having people coming in, or the white, worried and wealthy being overwhelmed, does not correspond to reality. And importantly, if we want to work towards the SDGs, but also if we want to really have cohesive societies where we live, we need to respect the rights of everybody. And I just want to also throw out what it means to be privileged, because I think that, I mean, I'm now stepping into a world where I work mostly with the private sector. And I just see that, you know, to be privileged in Switzerland, I don't know, you need to have a Porsche, you need to have at least 3 Rolexes, and you need to send your kids to private school. That's not being privileged. Being privileged is having a roof over your head that doesn't leak too much, having food almost every day, having access to basic healthcare, not being arbitrarily detained, not having to walk to get water, having heating in winter that works almost all the time. We are, and again, I'm making presumptions about your lives and your life history, but I know that I'm extremely privileged. I have immense debts, okay? I mean, I'm not, that's my personal situation right now, which I'm sharing with you. I'm extremely privileged simply because of where and when I was born. In Europe, in the 70s, Botox, because my rights have always been respected. I had free education, I had a roof over my head, I had access to healthcare, and that made me empowered to make choices that did not necessarily always land me my dream job, but it did give me the possibility to work towards goals that I decided. So being privileged is simply being not too poor in Europe compared to the rest of the world. That does not mean we don't need to address poverty in Europe and other global north countries. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we really do need to sort of like think about what does the rest of the world look like, And why are people getting on boats in the Mediterranean Sea, boats that we wouldn't take to cross Lake Geneva? And what has happened to them before that? And what can we do to develop policies and programs that not only respect people when they come onto our territories? Why is it in everybody's best interest to respect migrant workers' rights in labor? Because if we don't, they are going to actually create a pocket of unfair competition for national labor. That's not their fault. It's because you have employers who, unless regulated and unless national labor force stand up for them, are ready to exploit. But we also need, obviously, to look at root causes, and that includes corruption. It includes how development aid is conditioned, how it's given. It includes how multinational companies are operating. A lot of people are very happy to get the latest iPhone and at the same time say, why don't these people go home? Well, they don't go home because they don't have a bloody home anymore, because where the minerals for your bloody iPhone was mined used to be their home, and well, it ain't there anymore. So there's all these sort of like connections that we really need to make. We also really need to remember that migrants really contribute to the host society. They work, they pay taxes when they're regular, when they're allowed to, and most of them would like to. They produce, and the better integrated they are, the better will that society actually cohere and work. And what's really interesting, and I will stop very soon because I know I am using up all my time, but what's really interesting right now is to see also what local authorities are doing to implement the SDGs and the international legal framework, because they see what happens if you need to just sort of like have a rhetoric which is anti-migration, limit racist, not even always limit racist, but also very explicitly racist. But they need their smaller communities to actually work. And there's a lot of really good practices in what local authorities are doing to integrate and to make sure that whoever employs migrants on their smaller territory actually respect the human rights and other rights of the individuals. So I think it's really, really important to remember how valuable well-managed migration can be. And that doesn't mean that there are not challenges. It doesn't mean that there are not also problems that needs to be considered face on. But I think it's an important message to get out there that if we really want to work towards the SDGs, which basically is about improving the livelihoods for everybody, or at least for those of us who already have good livelihoods, keep them at a good level, it is important to stand up and to protect the rights of everybody. One last comment is also that if we don't stand up for those who don't have a voice, well, then sooner or later we will see our own rights eroded. I think there's a very, very scary tendency to, for those of us who have had our rights respected all our lives, to think that that's because we deserve it, or that it is sort of like just a given. It really isn't. Our parents, our grandparents, depending on how old we are, fought very, very, very tooth and nail to, for instance, have labor rights respected. My grandmother went into service and had like 6 years of school, and that was it. I managed to go to university and somehow make something of myself. That was because I grew up in a country where my rights were respected and furthered. But if we don't stand up for those groups who right now are being attacked, and I'm actually not only speaking about migrants, I'm also speaking about the judiciary, two very different groups, but two groups that if we don't stand up for these groups, then we will see our rights eroded. The last ones probably being the white wealthy males, because those were the ones who had rights for the longest time, and they'll probably hold on to them for the longest. But if you don't really care about migrants, then you need to care about yourself, basically.
Thanks, Kristina.